For loops are used to repeat a section of code a specific number of times. So they're similar to a while loop, but they can sometimes make the code shorter if you know how many times you want your loop to repeat. So there's three parts that go in the parentheses on a for loop. A while loop just has one Boolean expression in the parentheses. The for loop has the Boolean expression, but it also has two other parts. So the first part is your initialization. This is where you declare and initialize a variable that you will be using to track how many times you go through the loop or some other value. Then you have the Boolean expression, and that's very similar to the while loop. When the Boolean expression is true, your loop will repeat, and when it's false, the loop ends. The third part is the update. So you will change the value of the variable that you set in the initialization stage. So you'll either add to it or subtract from it, sometimes do more complicated math, but it's usually an increment or decrement. So we've got those three parts in the parentheses, each part separated by a semicolon. And then just like the while loop, there are curly braces, and you can put lines of code in between them, and that section of code is going to be what's repeated. So just to recap and to go through the order, because it doesn't run in the order that it's written, we start with the initialization, then we check the Boolean expression. If it's false, we skip over the entire for loop, going down to the closing curly bracket, and move on with our code. If the Boolean expression is true, then we execute the body of the for loop. So we skip the update at first, and we just go straight into the body of the for loop and run that. Then we go and do the update. So that's actually the fourth part, is the update, either adding or subtracting from our variable. And then we loop back and we check our Boolean expression again. If it's true, we repeat the process. If it's false, we're done. So the order is initialization, check the Boolean expression, run the body of the for loop, do the update, and then go back and check the Boolean expression and possibly repeat. So here's a visual of that. We start with our initialization, check our Boolean expression or a condition. If it's done, we end. If it's true, we do our body of our for loop, then our increment or decrement, and then check our condition again. So here's a simple example of a for loop. We have our initialization step, so we're declaring a variable called I and initializing it to the value 1. Then we have our Boolean expression, I less than or equal to 10. So in this case, that is true. So we're going to go ahead and execute the body of the for loop. So it will print out I, which is 1. Then we do our increment. So adding 1 to I, so I becomes 2. Then we check our Boolean expression. 2 is less than or equal to 10. That's true. So we print out I, so then we print out 2. We add 1 to I to get 3. Check our Boolean expression, and so on. So our output is going to be the numbers 1 through 10 printed out. That's not the only way to do that. Here are 2 more examples of printing the numbers 1 through 10, all slight variations on this, and there are even more equivalent for loops. So here's our initial one that we just looked at. Another way to do that is to change our Boolean expression. So instead of I less than or equal to 10, we could write I less than 11. So those are equivalent as long as we're working with integers and we're adding 1 each time. If we were working with doubles or we weren't increasing by 1 each time, then these may not be equivalent. But in this case, they are. They still print numbers 1 through 10. And then a third version is we could have I starting at 0 and going through 9. And then we'd print out I plus 1. So in this case, I plus 1 isn't changing the value of I. When we run this print statement, the value of I doesn't change. It just prints a number that's 1 bigger than the current value of I. So when I starts at 0, the first thing we'd print is 1. Then we would do our increment, I becomes 1. 1 is less than or equal to 9. So then we come in and print 2. Then we change I to become the value 2, and so on. So every for loop that you write, there are multiple ways to write it, and you want to be able to identify when for loops are equivalent. So here's another example, and this time we have 2 variables that we're going to use. One is just a regular local variable, int sum, starting at 0. And then in our for loop, we are initializing I to 1, so we're declaring and initializing I in the first part of our for loop. We've got our Boolean expression that involves I. And then inside the for loop, we're adding I to sum. So the first time that we iterate through our for loop, sum is going to get the value of 0 plus 1, which is 1. So we can see over here, sum gets the value of 1. Then we do our increment, and this time our increment is adding 2 to I. So the plus equals, remember that's shorthand for I gets I plus 2. So in our next iteration, I is going to be 3, because 1 plus 2 is 3. And then we're adding I to sum again, so sum becomes 4. Then we move up, do this increment. I becomes 5. 5 is still less than or equal to 10, so we repeat this process until I gets value 9. When I is 9, we run the loop. Sum becomes 25. Then when I is 9, we do our increment. So 9 plus 2 is 11. We check our Boolean expression. 11 is not less than or equal to 10, so we skip down and print out sum.